Thank you for coming to this afternoon's session of our 2013 Festival of Faiths with the title I believe you all know, Sacred Silence, Pathway to Compassion. We have yet another sure to be fabulous program just before us, as we have had so many fabulous ones that have preceded us. And I want to make sure and mention that all of these programs are being filmed and in real time edited and posted up on the internet, which means that anything that you'd like to see again, or that you haven't seen, or that you'd like to tell somebody else you'd like them to see, are going to be beautifully presented in real time, but also after the fact on YouTube. And the search for that, youtube.com/Festival of Faiths. We'll get you a lot, and we'll more on that. We'll get back to you on that. But we're going to do a big bunch of email blasts so you all can find this easily, and also our Festival of Faiths website will have that before you. As you all know, we are totally indebted to those that have made this festival possible, and I just want to quickly read off the big strategic partners, along with a lot of others who have provided us financial support, including Brown-Forman, and great strategic support from the city of Louisville. Same goes for the Archdiese of Louisville, the Earth and Spirit Center, the Muhamad Ali Museum, Louisville Public Media, DGI, the Thomas Merton Center, Fons Vitae, Compassionate Louisville, Idea Festival, Val Jones and the Whiskey Row Lofts, and Christy Brown. We also have an extraordinary team in our office led by Dr. Kathleen Lyons, along with Chris Wooten, who you just heard. Thank you so much, Chris. It's rare to have you in this room. He's so often doing other things while we're enjoying ourselves. And it's your hard work that we are totally grateful to you for, along with Sarah Reed Harris. The woman to my right, many of you, if not all of you, surely know, is our beloved friend and my fabulous co-collaborator and co-programmer, Gray Henry, and she's going to introduce our speakers to you. We're going to do the silence afterwards.
All right. We are so blessed to have Rabbi Joe Green with us. I have had his book, the huge Crossroads volume on Jewish spirituality, for years, and I had no idea you could ever invite someone like that to Louisville. And anyway, he's here, and let me tell you a little bit about him. He's the rector of Hebrew College's Rabbinical School, recognized as one of the world's preeminent authorities on Jewish thought and spirituality. In addition to his rabbinical school role, he serves as Irvin Brudnick Professor of Philosophy and Religion and as Professor Emeritus at Brandeis University. Previously, he taught at the University of Pennsylvania and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, where he served as Dean and President from 1984 to 1993. A prolific author, his most recent books are Radical Judaism and a revised edition of his Jewish vocabulary. These are the words. Oh, there are many other books. I'm sure you can see them out at the Carmichael stand. And also, he is being introduced by our very own Joe Rapport, who has been such a source of information and love and joy and to all of us here in Louisville over the years, and one of our great collaborators in all interfaith matters. Rabbi Rapport has served his congregation since 1988. He received his PhD in American Jewish History in 1988 from Washington University in St. Louis, and a Master's of Arts in History from the same in 1986. Rabbi Rapport is a graduate of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, where he was ordained in June of 1984. At the Temple, Rabbi Rapport oversees many programs. He teaches in a variety of adult education classes, as well as teaching children of the Temple's religious school at the High School of Jewish Studies, guiding the Temple confirmation class and working closely with bar and bat mitzvah students. Each summer, he works with Jewish children during a two-week session at the Goldman Union Camp Institute in Zionsville, Indiana. In the community at large, Rabbi Rapport offers a course in Jewish philosophy at Bellarmine and is often called upon to speak throughout the city. We are so grateful that he will be available today to moderate.
And before we welcome our speakers,
Tell them.
and Rabbi Green, if it's okay, your cue will be when we hit the bell for the second time. We're going to begin our session and end it. And Rabbi Joe, would you be willing to do the bell ringing for 3 minutes of silence at the end of our session? Okay, great, we're covered. And so I'll just leave the bell here, and Gray and I will stand here at the podium for the next 3 minutes while we start our session with a session of silence. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Green.
Thank you, thank you. Come to Louisville and talk about silence, they said to me. Well, I had to remember an event like this one. Oh, it was about 40 years ago, I would say. It was held by Fordham College in the Bronx. And there were 4 of us who were invited as speakers representing spiritual traditions around the world. The topic was a very nice one for Christians and Jews. It was the seasons of the year in our spiritual traditions. It was not so comfortable for the Eastern speakers, who were less interested in that. The speakers were Brother David Steindl-Rast, a wonderful Benedictine monk, Swami Satchidananda, the head of the local Zen center, and your humble servant, probably something under 30 years of age, representing the Jewish tradition. And we each spoke. Brother David gave a lovely talk about Christianity and the seasons of the year, and I spoke about Judaism. Time came for the Zen master to get up, and he said, "I have 15 minutes, we will sit." That's all he said. He took out his cushion, and I was tempted to do that today, of course, because here we are talking about silence, but I couldn't quite get away with it, I know. It's now about half a century since large numbers of Westerners have become interested in Eastern spiritual practice, especially meditation, in order to attain inner peace, enlightenment, personal spiritual growth. It's an open secret that a disproportionate number of those seekers are Jews. The silence they encounter in Zen monasteries or in Vedanta ashrams must feel very unfamiliar to them, because the home culture they come from is one in which people are incapable and mostly disinterested in silence. On the contrary, Jews tend to be very chatty people. Walk into a synagogue before the service begins, and you'll notice how noisy it is as people greet one another. In contrast to most churches, people don't know how to sit there and just be quiet. In the old days, the prayer leader would bang on the podium before he began the service. Nowadays, the Reformed rabbi or cantor strums the guitar loudly to let people know it's time to be quiet because the service is about to begin. During the past couple of decades, however, a good number of those people, some of them even with the guidance of their Eastern teachers, have come home to their own tradition. One of the gifts they've brought back with them is the love of silence. And so we have now given rise to classes, seminars, and treatises on Jewish meditation. This is one of the great enrichments we Jews have experienced in this new contact between Eastern and Western traditions, which I believe is such an important part of the age in which we live. I can tell you that more books have been written on Jewish meditation in the past 20 years than in the preceding 2000. I know because I study the old ones. But none of that is to say, of course, that silence has no place in Jewish tradition. In the old days, when intense devotionalism was more characteristic of Jews, we had moral treatises, spiritual treatises that had chapters on ma'alat hashtika, the value of silence, the importance of silence. The great Jewish philosopher in the 11th century, Bach ibn Bakuda, wrote about silent prayer as the true heart of what prayer is, the duty of the heart. Interestingly, he was influenced by a surrounding Sufi culture. Even earlier, the Talmudic rabbis said about prayer, a word of prayer is worth a penny, but silence is like a precious stone. They understood. And anybody who truly appreciates the subtleties of Jewish liturgy will understand what an important role silence plays in it, even though we don't talk about it. There's a moment on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, just before the final prayer is to begin, the Kaddish of Nila, which is sung, chanted in a unique melody that's only at that moment. And you can feel the silence in the room among people who know, waiting for that strain of melody to come forth. In a memorial service or a Yizkor service, we had one yesterday, there is a prayer called God Full of Mercy. And people wait, you can hear the tears being held back in the silence before that begins, until they finally come out when the name of the soul of the deceased or the people being memorialized are mentioned. In a joyous moment in the Hallel service on Sukkot, I remember being at a Hasidic synagogue in Brooklyn. There must have been 5,000 men in that room, and absolute silence until you could hear the rabbi rustling the leaves of his lulav, of his palm branch, just before beginning to call out, "Praise the Lord, for he is good." And you could feel the joy in that silence, in that moment of anticipation. A good prayer leader, even on a daily basis or a weekly basis, we begin our service morning and evening with a call to prayer called Baruch Hu, bless the Lord. And a good prayer leader knows to wait just a few seconds before that happens so that the silence becomes part of the prayer. I once heard Elie Wiesel say that the moment after a Beethoven symphony finishes, that moment between the conclusion and the beginning of the applause, that moment also belongs to Beethoven. And that's very much true of our liturgy as well. But there are deeper silences than that as well. Think about the silence between Abraham and Isaac as they walked for 3 days up the hill toward Mount Moriah without a word being recorded between them until they got there. Abraham's silence again when he realized there were not 10 righteous men to be found in Sodom, and therefore the city was going to be destroyed. When Aaron the high priest's 2 sons are killed by a fire coming out of the altar, all we're told about their father is, Vayidom Aharon, Aaron was silent. What's the quality of all those silences? What transpires during each of those silences? When Elijah goes up to the mountain, he fasts for 40 days and 40 nights, and then he hears the sound of God and the sound of gentle silence, called Mamadaka, usually translated as still small voice, but it's really the sound of delicate silence, or the sound of gentle silence. True prayer, like great poetry, is a delicate balance between sound and silence, between speech and silence. In great poetry, you can hear the silences between the spoken words. We call prayer avodah shebalev, service within the heart. How can words ever adequately express what's in our hearts? The fullness of joy and gratitude, but just as much the emptiness of desolation and abandonment. Both of these feelings in the heart are equally inaccessible to words. Words really can't convey them. All we can do is pray for the ability to pray. That's all we can do. May I be up to the task of praying. Then we somehow realize that too, the words of prayer too, like everything else, is a gift that's given to us. They're not our words. And so we begin each of our great prayers, the great prayer service of the day, in our traditional liturgy recited 3 times a day. We begin it by saying, "O Lord, open my lips that my mouth may declare your praise," a line from the Psalms. Lord, open my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. We used to say the power to pray, the power to even open my lips in prayer is not mine. That too comes to me only by the grace of God. What then do I say? I might have thought at least the words were my own. The silence, the inner silence belonging to God, but they're my words. But the psalmist seems to read things the other way around. It's the silence that's mine. The gift of word comes from God, who opens my lips. The Hasidic masters, who are our greatest teachers on the subject of prayer, understood that both the silence and the words belong to God. It's God's silence broken by God-given words. They quote another verse from the Psalms, "Lift up your voice like a ram's horn" about prayer, which is to say, all you are is God's megaphone. All you are is the horn through which the words are spoken. There's nothing more than the voice of God that through you emerges from the silence. What then is prayer? Is prayer an inner conversation within the divine self, God praying to God? But surely we real human beings, the ones praying, have to have something to do with it. They are our prayers, after all. We're the ones offering them. They are the prayers of our hearts. What then is prayer? First, let me tell you what prayer is not. Prayer is not simply a conversation with God, one in which you, the prayer, are in one place, and God, the listener, is someplace else, listening or not. I like to describe this model of prayer, which is the model most people still have, by the story of the Chassid, the pious Jew, in the telephone booth. What's the story? Well, our friend is very busy conducting his affairs in New York on a weekday afternoon. He's in the middle of Grand Central Station, and he realizes it's about 6 o'clock. It's time for afternoon prayers. It must be early spring or late fall, and so sunset happens just around then, and he realizes, I have to say my afternoon prayers before sunset comes. He's a little bit embarrassed to just go up to a wall in Grand Central Station and begin praying. He looks around and sees a bay of telephones, picks up a telephone and begins his prayers. Ashrei she'esecha, happy are those who dwell in your house, O Lord. He begins to pray. At that moment, the great station is God's house. And the Chassid's prayer may be very deeply felt in his heart. It should not be judged by the too simple question, is there anybody on the other end of the line? That's what I mean when I say what prayer isn't. The relationship between the one who prays and the one who receives prayer is not like two ends of the telephone. Many years ago, a friend and I were preparing an anthology of Jewish texts on prayer. It was the first book I ever published called Your Word is Fire, Hasidic teachings on prayer. We found them in a number of old prayer manuals that had been collected over the years. There's a book called The Book of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov is the first great central figure of Hasidism, and there's a long, it follows the order of the Torah, but there's a long 80 or 90-page digression on prayer, teachings on prayer. I had the privilege of studying that with my own teacher, the late Abraham Joshua Heschel. And so shortly after I was ordained as a rabbi, we began preparing those teachings for a book. The one that spoke most to me was a teaching of Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz, a friend of the Baal Shem Tov, who said very simply, people think you pray to God, and that is not the case. Rather, prayer itself is of the essence of God. Prayer is of the divine essence. Where is God, as our friend in the telephone booth begins to pray? Where is God? All around him, of course, filling up that hall of Grand Central Station just as intensely as he filled the tabernacle that had so much God in it that Moses was unable to enter. And God is in our Chassid's heart, just as God is in the hearts of all those other folks standing next to all the other telephones. Some of them talking to sick children at home, some of them telling a spouse, I love you, before they go to travel. But God is also in the hearts of those who are asking for the latest stock quotations and those cursing out the travel agents for having messed up the reservations. God is in their hearts too. If we could only see and hear that room from the divine point of view, we would understand that's a New York City Symphony of the Angels. In fact, the only difference between that Chassid who was at prayer and the others is that he has stopped to listen. He has stopped to notice that Grand Central Station has become a symphony of the angels. He's taken the time to acknowledge that he lives in God's house. God is present in the words he's saying. Hopefully, if he's paying attention, he is present too. Prayer, then, is about listening and listening to the inner silence as much as it is about speaking. Let your ear hear the words you are saying, the Talmud says about prayer. The proper way to pray. If prayer is the essence of divinity, then the process of praying, the whole process, is a holy one. It takes place inside us and takes place around us. In prayer, we give voice to the deepest self that lies hidden within us, to that spark of divinity buried deeply within our souls. But that innermost spark, like the highest teaching, like the highest Torah, dwells in a realm far beyond words, really a realm that's wordless in itself. We give it the gift of language, allowing it to come forth and present itself to our conscious self. We say, Lord, open my lips, but we begin the words, which are a gift. The prayer is a gift to God. They are our gift. We do not pray alone. God prays through us. We may provide the words, but the divine stirring in our hearts makes the music. On the face of things, prayer is absurd. I have to talk to God by doing this strange thing of moving my mouth and having sounds come out of my throat for God to hear me, when God is in my heart. Indeed, God is my heart is God. Why do I have to do this thing of uttering sounds? Not because God needs to hear the words, certainly, but because we do. For the prayer to be ours, it has to be a vehicle for the soul to communicate with us as well. It has to be in our language, not because God needs them. As the innermost self of God makes itself manifest to us, it needs to reach and travel through all our most vulnerable and needy places. It needs to take our needs with it, as it were. The spirit that comes forth needs to travel through our most wounded and hurting and needed places to carry them along and make them part of the prayer, along with our places of joy and celebration and wonder and mystery. The term that most Ashkenazic European Jews use for praying, to pray in Yiddish, is davnen. To daven means to pray, to recite liturgical prayers every day. Nobody knows where that word daven comes from. It is not German, Hebrew, or Slavic, which are the roots of almost all words in the Yiddish language. Some people have tried to connect it to the Latin divinus, of course, divinity, daven, to do something holy. Some philologists tried to connect it to the English word dawn, because you say your morning prayers as the sun rises, and so daven, dawn, sounded good. I heard a lecture by a Yiddish philologist many years ago, the late Yudel Yoffe, and he said the word daven, it turns out, first appears in print in the 16th century in books published by Jews in Lithuania, in Lithuanian prayer books. And it's a copy of a Lithuanian language word. You know, the Lithuanian language is one of the Baltic languages, very unconnected to most other European languages. In Lithuanian, there's a word for a gift that sounds like daven. And he explained that Jews would say their morning prayers in the synagogue, and their evening prayers maybe at home, but their afternoon prayers, which are called mincha in Hebrew, and mincha means offering or gift, their afternoon prayers they would have to say in their market stall. And so a storekeeper might have to say to his customer, "Excuse me, I have to give a gift now." And he would then turn to the wall and say his afternoon prayers. And so that became the term for praying, giving a gift. I don't know if that's really the origin of the term, but I've always liked the idea that davnen, that to pray, is to give a gift to God. After the ancient temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, you remember, prayer replaced the sacrifices that had once been offered. The way to worship God was indeed to give a gift. It was no small thing for a farmer to bring a prize animal to the temple and offer it to the priest to have it raised up to the altar. The gift of words must have seemed paltry by comparison, a gift too easily falsified and costing nothing at all. But we should remember what lay behind that sacrificial gift. Animal sacrifice replaced human sacrifice at some early point in human history. But the memory of human sacrifice was never quite entirely forgotten. There was a time in ancient Israel when firstborn sons were sacrificed. The Bible already tells us they are to be redeemed, they are to be replaced. But behind that memory of replacing them was a more ancient memory of sacrificing them. Surely the story of the binding of Isaac and the story of the slaying of the firstborn in Egypt are both tied to that ancient, then repressed memory of what it means to kill the firstborn. In Christianity, of course, it remained crucial to the central act of worship. God gave the sacrifice, but the shedding of human blood was still required for atonement. There was still that memory of ancient sacrifice that was so powerful, and therefore carried over from Judaism into Christianity. But the offering of a son was a substitute. You gave that new life, you gave the life of your firstborn in replacement for your own. The sense was that I owe my life to God, or to the gods in even earlier times, and God has a right to demand it of me. I ward that off, at least for a while, by offering the life of my beloved offspring. How distant we are from those ancient memories, how long ago it was, how much forgotten. And yet how unchanged is our essential human situation. Yes, we still owe our lives to that mysterious force of life we call God. that lies both within us and far beyond our comprehension or control. With all the advances of modern science, we are still mortal, and one day we will have to let go of that gift of life. And we still hope to postpone the coming of that day as long as we can, but we do not sacrifice our children. Prayer comes in place of sacrifice, in paltry place of sacrifice. In true prayer, we give the only gift we have. One of the Hasidic masters intentionally misread a verse in the Psalm, Psalm 69, which says, Va'ani tfilati. He read it to mean, I am my prayer. I am my prayer. All I have to give is myself. We have learned to give ourselves to God doesn't mean to climb up on the altar. The prophets long ago taught us a better way. We give ourselves by opening our hearts, by being present to God's presence in our lives, by sharing with others, by generosity of spirit, by caring for the needy, among whom God's presence, of course, so much dwells. Now we begin to see the cycle of prayer in its wholeness and go back to Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz's statement, prayer is of the very essence of divinity. I say, Lord, open my lips. I ask God for the strength to help me pray, to be present within my prayer. What is it that I ask of God? Help me, O Lord, to give myself to you. Help me, O Lord, to give myself to you. We seek the God deeply present within as we offer ourselves to the God beyond, while we know there's no real separation between the God within us and the God beyond. Prayer itself is of the essence of divinity. That's what he said, the whole process. There's only one more step to go. If I am all I have to give to God, the same has to be true of God as well. All God has to give to me is God. And so again, they read the Psalm 102, Tfilah la'ani, a prayer of a poor man. They read it as though it said, a prayer to a poor man. Pray to God as though you were praying to a pauper who has nothing to give to you, nothing to offer but his own self. So too do they read Jeremiah's words, blessed are those who trust in the Lord, and the Lord is the object of their trust. I come to trust in the Lord when I know that all I want from God is God, nothing else. Sacred speech in the Jewish conversation is about two things. It's about prayer, as I've spoken until now, but it's also about Torah. It's about the Word of God. God gives us the words of Torah, a verbal revelation, a verbal gift, teaching us how we are to live. Those teachings are unpacked and expanded through the process of generations studying and interpreting them. That's the ongoing process of Judaism itself. We respond by taking the words and the letters of those teachings and rearranging them and making them into prayers and giving that gift of words back to God. Make the teachings into prayers. The Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, the great Hasidic master of the early 19th century, said, always make the teachings into prayers. Take the teachings, receive the teachings, and then give them back in the form of prayers. But if prayer reflects the dialectic between words and silence, so too does revelation. The revealed Torah is the very basis of Judaism, a document filled with many words. Christians will understand that you and we share a tale of origins, a faith in the ancient Torah that existed before the world was created. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The opening of the Gospel of John is entirely Jewish. Only in the next line do we diverge, of course. The Word became flesh for Christians. For us, the Word remained Word, that of our Holy Torah. We've just completed the festival of Shavuot, or Pentecost, the festival that commemorates our receiving of the Torah. The lifeblood of Judaism, our Eucharist, if you will, is the constant study and interpretation of that Torah. It is the way we partake of God, studying, teaching, passing it on, reinterpreting. But that Torah that existed before creation, the Torah of in the beginning was the Word. What was written in it, our sages ask? Did it really say that Methuselah lived 900 years and begat sons and daughters? Did it really say that Lotan was Timnah's sister, or that Lotan's sister was Timnah, or did it have a list of Edomite kings, or a list of rules about taboos and about skin diseases and everything else? Could it really have happened that way? Could the primordial Torah really have contained all the events that were to happen in history, including quotations from people who weren't born yet? Doesn't make sense. As soon as you say there was a Torah, there was a word of God before creation, you have to be talking about something else than just the narrative and laws of the Torah as we have them. Indeed, was it really verbal at all? Our ancestors, you see, believed the Hebrew language was sacred and primordial. God spoke the world into being. God said, "Let there be light," in Hebrew, of course. And so the Hebrew language must have been there before creation. But we understand that language itself is part of the evolution of humanity. We had human or semi-human ancestors at one point who did not yet have speech. In fact, Hebrew comes rather late on the tree of Semitic languages. So what then was the Torah when there were not yet words, when there was not yet language? It couldn't be anything other than a book of silence. It contained within it the potential story of all existence, the story of every creature, human and otherwise, who was ever to exist, but all of them still unspoken and unwritten. In some ways, it was a blank book. God is the fullness that contained and contains all of them, contains everything that is ever to be, but still in silence. Only we as human speakers give the words to God, translating the divine silence into language. That's our job. We're translators. We translate the divine silence into language. And as we do so, the Hasidic masters taught, God is transformed and so are we. Transcendent mystery is translated into stories, into deeds, into an ethos by which we can live, ways in which we can create a sacred community. The Hasidic masters have various ways of talking about this. One of them says that when the Torah was revealed at Mount Sinai, God spoke. But in Exodus 20, right after the Ten Commandments, it tells you, the people called out to Moses, "You speak with us that we may live. Let not God speak with us any longer, lest we die." The question is, just when did they say that? The Bible text seems to say they said it after the Ten Commandments. The rest came through Moses. But an ancient teaching said in the Talmud says, no, they said it after the first two commandments. All they really heard from God were the first two commandments. In our accounting, that is, I am the Lord your God who brought you forth from Egypt, and have no false gods beside me. Everything else came through Moses. But a famous Hasidic master said all they really heard from the word of God, from the mouth of God, was the first letter of the first word. The first word of the revelation, I am, in Hebrew is Anochi, I am. And it begins with the letter Aleph. And the letter Aleph, without a vowel point under it, is pronounced. That's all they heard from God. All we heard from God was the divine silence. And we are charged with filling up that silence with language. We are charged with translating that silence into words. Another teaching says the word Anochi, the word I am, is actually an acronym. It stands for 4 words in Aramaic. I myself wrote it and gave it. I myself wrote it and gave it, trying to prove, as it were, that the Torah came from God directly, not by an angel. But a later reading of that says, it doesn't say, I myself wrote it and gave it. It says, I wrote and gave myself. I wrote and gave myself. God is translated into language, into words. All this requires a partnership, and we believe in partnership between the human and the divine. Bringing God into language is part of our most sacred activity as human beings. Our most sacred activity as human beings is that of sharing with the hidden God our most precious gift, and that is the gift of personhood, of humanity itself. We are fashioned in the divine image in ways far beyond our ken, but we then return the favor, recreating God in the image of a human being and bringing the primordial divine word, the great mystery, which the mystics say is nothing other than the name of God itself, into human speech, into human reality. What I'm seeking to portray here are a pair of twin silences. One is our inner silence, filled with pain, joy, loss, fullness, emptiness, and all those other things within us that language can never quite convey, but that somehow need to be channeled into our prayer. The other is God's silence, or the cosmic silence of the universe, if you prefer. The one that stands behind all our teachings and yet is fully within them, that need to be brought forth into language by our human selves. These two silences meet at the bridge of sacred speech, and both of them are transformed. That is the place where religion is born, creating the pathways by which we walk all our sacred journeys. Thank you.
Are we on? Yes. We're going to continue the conversation. I'll open with just some thoughts, comments, and share with Arthur.
He's been taking notes, I've noticed.
Yes, well, I want to save these for as long as I can. And then, thank you, Elsa. And then we'd very much like to invite you to join the conversation. And the lights will be brought down at that point so that I can see and call on you. And I'm given to understand we'll have some people who can bring around some microphones, or I'll repeat the questions you might have. So give some thought, meditate on that for a moment, amidst our conversation of things that you'd like to ask or share in brief words that perhaps Rabbi Green can respond to. So I thought I'd begin with kind of where you left off just a bit, at Sinai, receiving the Ten Commandments, and this sense of silence, which pervades that moment. And you kind of alluded to this tradition within Judaism that the words of Torah are an eternal thing that come forth from Sinai always. And yet we only heard at that one moment because God allowed us to create that silence within us to be able to actually hear those words. And the sort of legend of the 70 elders, or the elders of the people of Israel that were brought to Sinai to represent the people of Israel who were too frightened by the actual sound of even the silence at the beginning. Just to follow that story a little bit further, the story of the 70 elders returned to the camp, having heard, as representatives of the people of Israel, these words of the Ten Commandments. And yet upon their journey back, they recognized that for each of the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 words, which is the way the word Ten Commandments is usually put forward, they heard a subtly different word. And it was only when they put all of their words together that they really understood the fullness of what God had intended, which suggests that what God spoke at Sinai wasn't necessarily language, but this sense of being that each of them interpreted into language in different ways. And the question that comes from that sort of long introduction is that traditions of silence and meditation, as opposed to the elements of traditions of words, stand kind of in distinction to one another. You can make an orthodoxy out of words. That's relatively easy. You just line the words up just the way that you want them to be, and then people need to follow those words, and you have an orthodoxy. Silence and meditation tends to be a lot harder to create into an orthodoxy, which is, I think, represented in a lot of ways by the fact that the meditative traditions in many faiths exist on the edge, and are by definition different from the sort of traditional or orthodox presentation. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that exists and doesn't exist within Judaism, because at least in form and on the surface, the tradition of Kabbalah, of mysticism in Judaism has framed itself as in a very orthodox context, perhaps out of fear of being viewed too fringe, or perhaps out of maybe an inherent part of that. So tradition and words as an orthodoxy, and silence and meditation as a definitionally unorthodox thing to do.
Well, we will have to find somebody at this conference, I imagine, this festival, who was raised in a Theravada Buddhist home and raised in a Theravada Buddhist monastery, and ask him if meditation and silence can be made into an orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. And I have a feeling he might tell us, surprised, that it can. I'm not so sure that that's not our Western idealization, that words can become an orthodoxy and that silence cannot. I have an idea that practices of silence can also be imposed and become dogmatic in the right cultural context. Mm-hmm. These things are universal phenomena. But I want to say something about being on the edge. For a long period of time, the Jewish mystical tradition considered itself esoteric. Mm-hmm. Mysticism and esotericism went hand in hand in Judaism, not so in Christianity. Christian mystical tradition was a devotional tradition practiced rather openly in monasteries. But Judaism, I think, was more like Sufism, was more like Islam in that way. The mystical tradition was somehow on the edge, and not everybody gave it credence. That was certainly true in the medieval era. It was certainly true in Spain, where the Zohar, the great work of Kabbalah, was written. But after the 16th century, mysticism became very popular. There was a great revival of mystical spirituality in 16th century around the town of Tzfat, around the town of Safed in the Holy Land, but its reputation spreading throughout the Jewish world. And in the world of Eastern European Hasidism, I would say mysticism, or a degree of mystical spiritual awareness, was very much a part of the popular culture. It was in modern Judaism, interestingly, that mysticism was pushed to the edge. We talked a little bit about it before. When I was a rabbinical student, my teacher, Abraham Joshua Heschel, was told he could not teach Hasidism as some of his main seminary courses because Hasidism was not mainstream Judaism. The notion of mainstream Judaism is a term you can't even say in classical Hebrew because there's no way to say it. It was invented at the turn of the 19th century by modernizing, westernizing Jews who were embarrassed by certain areas of the Jewish tradition, especially mysticism. They wanted to present Judaism as a modern, progressive, rational, ethical, monotheist tradition. Mm-hmm. You know, the first people to allow us into polite company in the Western world were liberal Protestants and deists. And we felt that we had to show them we had a religion just like theirs. So anything that would upset that apple cart of respectability was swept under the rug. And mysticism was too hokey, was too strange, was too irrational to present. And so I think it's more in modern Judaism than in the earlier tradition that mysticism is moved to the far edge, and only now at the turn of the 21st century is beginning to come back and beginning to find its way back into the tradition.
So that was my next, thank you for leading into my next question. That was very nice of you. We didn't practice this or anything, but I wanted to return to sort of the beginning of your thought, the idea of the Jewish people being a very talkative people, and talking about silence itself being somewhat of an absurdity. But you mentioned the rise, relatively speaking, of the mystical tradition in general and the meditative aspects of that within the last 50 years. And clearly your teacher, Abraham Joshua Heschel, had, I think, a very significant role in that. And I'm wondering if you could kind of How much of that do you attribute to Heschel or people like Rosenzweig and Buber as well, who brought this mystical and this Hasidic faith into sort of a respectable standard in Western society through their writings, through their teachings? How much of that is a function of these individuals, or how much do you think that that is a function of the outside world and sort of the millennial, move or from the 60s to say the year 2000 of an interest in that outside the Jewish community, where then Jewish people were beginning to look, within themselves for a tradition that had been waiting for them?
Now I'll have to rewrite what I was going to say at the temple tonight,
Uh-oh.
because you asked me the question here, but I'll manage.
Yes.
It has to do with many things. Much of it has to do with the bigger question. I was a college student on campus in the 60s, the early 60s, when Professor Suzuki used to come around to campus and speak about Zen Buddhism. Mm-hmm. That was the very beginning of Western interest in the philosophies of the East. And then there was Zen and the art of this and that. Mm-hmm. And then it was the turn of the Indian teachers, and then the Tibetans, and the reigniting of interest in Kabbalah is part of all that. I think all of that begins with the crisis in the West's faith in itself in the middle of the 20th century. After Auschwitz and after Hiroshima, life is not the same. I think the real faith of Western people from about 1750 to about 1950 was faith in science. We are going to solve all the problems of the world. Real knowledge is progress, and we are turning away the darkness, and we will know everything soon. Mm-hmm. And then when Auschwitz happened in the midst of the greatest scientific country in Europe, and then Hiroshima, which is of course not its moral equivalent, but nevertheless changed things forever after 1945. Ours is the first generation, more or less, I'm a little bit older, but ours is the first generation to have grown up in the shadow of nuclear holocaust. Right? We had a name for the guy. Dr. Strangelove will come and push the button, and then it will be all over. Growing up in such a world, you need to reach for something deeper. And Western religion was somehow compromised. It had become progressive and scientific and modern. So the teachings of the East became very attractive. I think there's a sense that in all this rush to modernity, there must be some great wisdom somewhere that we have forgotten. And if we had that wisdom, it would teach us how to live better and not to destroy ourselves. Maybe the Tibetans have it. Let's go climb a mountain. Maybe the yogis have it. Let's go stand on our heads. Maybe the Kabbalists have it. Let's learn about the Sfirot. Maybe, what did we forget? What did we lose in becoming modern, becoming progressive? How can we change our life? We have watched in our lifetime the threat change from the nuclear to the ecological. Well, maybe that we won't blow up the world, but we've so overconsumed that we will indeed have nothing left to pass on to the next generation. Where's the wisdom of the ancients that will teach us how to live differently, how to relate differently to the world around us? I think that's what it's all about. It's that quest which is a very 20th century quest. Now, Heschel and Buber prepared the way. So did Gershom Scholem, by the way, the great critical scholar of Kabbalah, who made the sources available to us. But I think it's this bigger self-questioning in the Western world that caused all this turn to recovering spirituality.
It's an interesting perspective that there was an emptiness in us that the silence tends to fill.
That's right. That's
fascinating. Okay, I have one more question, and then I'd like to draw some from the gathering. But I thought it might be interesting for the group for you to kind of give some perspective on the progression of the structured Jewish prayer service as it comes from that moments of sacrifice to moments of prayer. And by what I mean by that is sort of the notion that Jewish prayer began with much more silence within it, and that favored blessings and prayers, began to provide some sort of a structure and an order for it, but there was always room left over for silence. And as that room for silence would recede behind words, to the point where we now have silent meditation as a very small part of the service, I've always viewed that as a sadness. But I was really struck by what you said about that, these small moments of silence before these great moments of spoken or sung prayer, that in a certain sense, that in their rarity and in their placement, they create a power that they might not have had if we sat in a room for an hour for silence, as opposed to place these moments of silence at critical points within the prayer service.
But you have to know how to do it, and you have to know how to listen to it.
Yeah.
And to train a new generation to listen to it is a job in itself.
Yes. Okay.
Oh, well, let me say two or three different things. The rabbis in the Talmud had a terrific idea. 100 blessings every day.
Yeah.
If people recite 100 blessings every day, bless you, Lord, for creating that rainbow, and bless you for creating this piece of bread, and bless you for creating the smell of these beautiful flowers, and bless you for this, and bless you for that. If we said 100 blessings every day, surely we'd be thinking of God all the time. Well, we said 100 blessings every day. Jews are very smart people. It took us a long time to figure out how to say 100 blessings every day and still never think about God.
There's an app for that now, by the way.
It can be
the
done.
100 Blessings app, you can
That's
download.
that's why we needed the mystical tradition. That's why we needed Hasidism, to bring the life back into the forms once the forms had become empty. I wrote a book a long time ago, a scholarly book called The Crown of God in Early Jewish Mysticism. We have a legend that there is an angel who goes about to every synagogue and every house of study where they're praying, because in each place people finish their prayers at different times. That angel goes around and picks up the prayers, especially the communal prayers, the amens that you can only say in a congregation of 10 or more. That angel goes around and picks up all those prayers and weaves them together as a crown for God. And that crown is given to another angel, the highest angel, Sandalphon, who raises the crown up every day and places it on God's head. And just as the crown is placed on God's head, the angels sing, Holy, 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 and that's the great Kedusha Sanctus, the great coronation moment. There's a daily coronation right in the heavens that takes place, but the crown is woven of prayers. I said to myself, why did they do that? Why did they create such a legend? And then it occurred to me that this legend probably goes back to the period in the first century when prayer, and we have it in second or third century texts already, where prayer replaced sacrifice as the form of worship. What does it mean? What good are prayers? As I said before, what good are prayers? How cheap it is, how easy it is. When you gave an animal on the altar, the smoke rose up to heaven, maybe even great rings of smoke, circles of smoke. So to say the prayer goes up and becomes a crown of God, the prayer does the same thing as the rings of smoke used to do, going up and reaching the highest heavens and being placed on God's head. So the idea that prayers are an actual gift to God, that something happens when you pray, it makes a difference. That's what the mystics insisted on. By the way, not everybody in the Jewish tradition did. Maimonides would have been horrified by that idea, that in prayer you give something to God. Maimonides would say, God is perfect and whole and has no need of us. Prayer is good for us, but not for God. But the mystics said, no, prayer is actually giving something to God. And yes, at one time the prayer service was less structured. There was a subject about which to pray, and then you concluded it with a certain blessing formula, blessing God for the light, blessing God for the Torah, blessing God for love, blessing God for redemption. But then the words, the text filled in. And you know the problem with liturgies is you can always add something. Oh, somebody writes a new prayer. That's great. Let's add that one to the prayer book.
Right.
But taking something out is very hard. Oh, I love that one. My Uncle Joe loved that one. My Aunt so-and-so. How can we take that one out? And so it all stays in. And then the book gets heavier and heavier. And then there's so many prayers to say that there's not much time left for silence. That's our history. And I wish I could say that our modern reformation of the prayer book had made more room for silence and inner prayer. I'm not sure that it has.
I hope someone wrote that down because I couldn't type that fast enough. But that's going to be a sermon someday. So can we bring the lights down a little bit on us, a little more up on the group so I can see?
Ah, there you are. Look at that.
And let's start over here with a question for Rabbi Green.
Thank you, Rabbi Green. I've learned a lot about the Jewish tradition and faith and prayers and recognize how much more. But in the context of the title of the Festival of Faith, Sacred Silence and a Pathway to Compassion, how is compassion contained within the daily Jewish faith tradition?
Just to frame that a little bit, there is in each festival of faith a social message that sort of runs beneath it, whether we just passed through a cycle that we were talking about of environmental messages. And that theme for this year is compassion and twinning that aspect of silence, meditation, and developing the sense of compassion. So more specifically, the role of compassion within Jewish tradition and where that comes forth.
Well, it has a few authors. Jeremiah is one, Amos is another, Moses himself is one. Remember, the tradition is the tradition that goes back to Abraham. And Abraham arguing with God at Sodom for compassion for those people. By the way, those people in Sodom whom Abraham wanted to save, they were not Israelites. You might call them Palestinians. They were other people who lived in the land. Abraham was concerned they were going to be destroyed, and so he risks everything. He risks his relationship with God by bargaining with God, by trying to get him down. If there are only 10 righteous in the city, will you save the city? The rabbis tell us 3 people were leaders of their generations. Noah was a failed leader. God said to him, I'm going to destroy the earth, build an ark. Noah did not argue. He built an ark, saved himself and his family alone. That's a failed leader. God came to Abraham and said, I'm going to destroy Sodom. Abraham said, no, you're not. If there are 50 people, will you save them? And then he goes down and down, 5 more, gets him down to 10, and then Abraham feels he can't ask anymore and gives up. God comes to Moses after the sin of the golden calf and says, I'm going to destroy Israel. Moses says, you will have to kill me first. That's the leader. That's what it means to be compassionate about ordinary people, caring for ordinary people, understanding the humanity of people, the inadequacy of people, and the needs of people. After the Baal Shem Tov, the first central figure of Hasidism, the most beloved of all Hasidic masters is Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. And Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev is a great master of compassion. He was always ready to forgive. When other people condemned, somebody came along, he was walking with another rabbi, and there was a Jew greasing the wheels on his wagon. And he was wearing his sacred garments. He was wearing a prayer shawl and tefillin. And the other rabbi said, how can he desecrate the holy word of God that's in his prayer boxes and his prayer shawl, wearing them when he greases his wagon wheel? And Levi Yitzchak turned around and said to me, you don't understand. Look how holy Jews are. Even when they grease their wagon wheels, they're wearing their holy garments, and so on. He was one of those people. So compassion, I would say, is the very heart of the tradition. We forget how often the Torah tells us to be kind to strangers because you were a stranger in the land of Egypt. We were formed as a people, remember, by the memory of slavery and by the memory of liberation. Jews have not forgotten that. It's not an accident that you will find Jewish names on the boards of directors of every organization in the Western world for human rights and struggle for human dignity. Many of those Jews will tell you it's because their grandparents were immigrants or because of what the Nazis did, but all of those people grew up attending Passover Seders. And it's because we remember that we were formed as a people by being slaves. And we know what slavery and oppression are. And we know what it means when other people are slaves. And we know what it means to stand for human dignity. So that is just deeply written into the Jewish soul, as much by historical experience of oppression as it is by dictates of the Torah. But they reinforce one another. And so the tradition cannot be other, I would say, than a tradition of compassion.
Thank you for your question. Someone else? Please, can someone bring a microphone over here?
So there are many Jewish people today who feel still alienated by what we find in the temples and the synagogues. What do you think, what would you recommend for a way to bring that back into our lives?
There is not a wholesale answer. You have to do it retail, not wholesale. Which is to say, different people have different needs. There is not a simple answer. Oh, if only the synagogues did this, right? Right. I remember talking to a young graduate of a rabbinical school, some 30 years ago or so. He was graduating rabbinical school in New York, and he had just gotten a pulpit in Marin County, north of San Francisco. And I said to him, well, lots of people out there have had lots of different kinds of spiritual and psychological experiences. What are you going to do for them? He said, yeah, we're going to have a service with lots of singing and enthusiasm. And I said, the kid just doesn't get it. Just doesn't get it. Maybe that will work for a couple of them, but that's not what it's all about. People need different things. We have to be open to a variety of spiritual experiences. I'm happy to say in many cities there are now synagogues that have meditation services. Sometimes they precede the regular service, sometimes they're offered as an alternative. You can have a meditation group in a synagogue that meets, that shares silence for half an hour and just ends with a Shema, just ends with a wordless Jewish melody. That's a form of Jewish worship that we should become more comfortable with. I don't think it will replace the service for everybody, nor should it be imposed on everybody, but it should be offered for people who want it. But that's only one kind of thing. I find lots of young people today, among my students, lots of young people today who really like traditional, old-fashioned Jewish style of worship. Sort of an old-fashioned minyan, an old-fashioned quorum of prayer, where you shout at your own pace and you pray at your own pace and you jump up and down at your own pace. And that should be permitted too. There should be room for that too. I gave up. I was 12 years old when I gave up on the liberal synagogue in which I was raised. Because I'd come back from summer camp where I learned to pray in a more traditional way, and I walked into the synagogue one Shabbat morning, Saturday morning during the Torah reading, and very quietly I got up and recited the Amidah, the silent prayer, and sat down and listened. And afterwards, when I went to say Shabbat Shalom to greet the rabbi, there was an elderly rabbi emeritus there, and he said to me, "Are you the young man who was standing during the service? We don't do that sort of thing here." And I ran to my grandparents' East European synagogue. And stayed there for a long time and learned a lot. So I'm happy he sent me there. But there are lots and lots of different things that need to be done because there are lots of different spiritual physiognomies of people. So there's not one answer.
If I can put in something I was going to put in at the end in any case, one answer, not a wholesale one, might be that I'd like to invite you all to come to services at the temple this evening because Rabbi Green will be speaking there, and it's open to the entire public, and we'd love to have you. It's at 7 o'clock at 5101 Brownsboro Road, and it'll be from 7 to 8, and that might give you an opportunity for that lots of singing and spirituality service. I don't know if that's going to be the one that's necessarily going to make a difference, but I did want to invite you all to join us. Back here.
Could you please elaborate between, or at least venture into it, the difference between a silence of the light is energy, and then the silence of sound, or if you experience that, and if you do, how would you notate it to realize the sparks, those illuminations or emanations where the feeling is recorded for eternity.
It's easy in sound to distinguish one sound from another. We have pitch, we have timbre, we have volume, lots of things you can distinguish. It's very hard to distinguish qualities of silence from one another, but they certainly exist. If Rabbi Joe would go to his congregation and say, "We will all be silent tonight," there would be a silence of discomfort. You'd hear the silence of squirming, right? If it's imposed on people, they don't know. You get kids in school and tell them to have a moment of silence, and you have a silence of squirming. There is a silence of light. I would call it a silence of fullness, where the energy and the anticipation and the about to burst forth fullness of things is being housed in the silence. And therefore you can feel the richness of that silence. You can feel the abundance in that silence. And there's a silence of loss and deprivation and emptiness, which is very different. There's also a silence of mystery. The silence of I can't tell you because I don't know, but I stand in wonder before. That's a different silence than the silence of fullness. I love shared silences. I love to be with a group of people and be silent together. I have had the privilege of teaching groups of rabbis for the past 5 or 7 years at something called the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, where we train rabbis in meditation. And I just love being with 50 people in a room for half an hour or an hour and being silent together. I also know that silence can be dangerous as a means of communication. You and I, when we talk to each other and say words, somehow, more or less, know what we're talking about. But if we share silence, and especially an intense silence, where you are and where I am may not be the same thing. And I have to be very careful not to project what's in my silence onto you without hearing what's in your silence. Because each of us begins from a different place and brings to a silence a different set of baggage. So shared silence is wonderful. Degrees of silence, types of silence, subtleties of silence are things we learn in experience. And silence in a group requires trust. We are going to share this silence for the next 10 minutes. That somehow means we trust one another to be vulnerable enough not to speak in each other's presence. That too is an important gift.
Thank you. Other questions over here? Chris?
I was raised Roman Catholic, and I'm still active in my church. And I was just wondering, how do you handle the whole idea of the different churches and synagogues, et cetera, being exclusive and not like, how do I get to accept that as being compassionate and loving if I'm excluding someone from my group?
Not easy. It is the fault of our traditions. The prophets had a great idea. The prophets of Israel had a great idea. They came along and said, what we are teaching you has nothing to do with religion as you think you understand it. The prophets were spiritual revolutionaries. So they came along and said, the God we're talking about is not like the God of the heathens, is not like the God of the idol worshippers. And they said, eyes have they, but they see not, ears have they, but they hear not, neither do they speak with their throats. They were saying, we're teaching you something very different. That came to be religious exclusivism. We are right and they are wrong. Our religion is true and their religion is false. We had a good deal of that coming out of the biblical legacy. And all three traditions that derive from that legacy bear its marks. Jews had a notion of chosenness. The Torah has been given to you alone. The Christians learned that from us with great passion. They became even better at it, right? No one can go to heaven if not through the gifts of the church. Everybody else is condemned to eternal perdition. Islam had its own version of that. We are the best, the fullest, the wholest. The others are okay up to a certain point, but the real fulfillment is only in ours. All of us bear that legacy that was well meant by religious revolutionaries a long time ago, but becomes a burden. Postmodern religion, the return to religion after the crisis of modernity, cannot be the same as pre-modern religion. In pre-modern religion, religion was a zero-sum game. If mine is true, yours is false. Goodbye. Postmodern religion, we are seeking the wisdom of the ancients. We are seeking to save our lives by going back and recovering the wisdom that humanity might have somewhere in its legacy. That wisdom could be anywhere, could be everywhere. So we Christians will learn something from the Buddhists, and we Jews will learn something from the Sufis, and the Sufis will learn something from the Hindus. Something we have seen in the last 20 or 30 years, think about it carefully. Each religious tradition acting alone is dangerous and can sometimes do terrible things. When religious communities act in concert across interreligious lines, they are generally acting for the good. We should learn something from that experience.
It's a very good question, thank you. Kathleen, did you want to take a personal privilege and ask a question? That'd be great.
I would love to. But first, Rabbi Arthur, I want to thank you for having said some of the most beautiful comments I've ever heard in my life on prayer. Believe me, I will remember long some of the things that you have said. And I'd like to ask you if maybe I have interpreted correctly the comment that you made about in prayer, we give what we have, which is what God has given us, ourselves, to God. And at the same time, God gives himself to us. And I missed about the next 5 minutes of what you said because I could not help turning that over. That was the truth. And you know, every once in a while, you hear something and you think, that's it. And that was my reaction. And it occurred to me that a conclusion from this is that really we pray all the time because we are who we are all the time. And if we have given ourselves, who we are, to God, maybe we've said it a dozen times, but we do it, it's not just for when we say it. If it means anything, it's all the time. And I just want to hear from you. Have I misinterpreted what you said, that to pray, you either do it or you don't, and if you do it, it's all the time?
I think you're doing pretty well.
Yeah.
I understand you had a session, I'm sorry I missed, about Hesych's prayer, about the Jesus prayer, and the repetition of prayer all the time. Let me say it around breathing, since so many of us have taken to a meditation that watches the breath. Genesis chapter 2. Vayipach ba'apo nishmat chayim. God blew the breath of life into Adam's nostrils. God blew the breath of life into Adam's nostrils. That moment, according to all the mystic teachers, did not happen just once. God is always blowing the breath of life into Adam's nostrils. And they said a long time ago, when you blow the breath of life into someone, where do you blow it from? You blow it from your own breath. You blow it from within yourself. So God is ever blowing the breath of life into Adam's nostrils. Keep that verse in mind and turn to the very last verse of the Psalms. The last psalm about the timbrels and the trumpets that summarizes all the Psalms. The Psalms end with the verse, Kol haneshama tehalel. Every breath praises God. Hallelujah. So in every moment, God is breathing the breath of life into our nostrils, and we are returning that breath by breathing it out in the breath of prayer. Hallelujah.
I'm going to take personal privilege for the last question, because I want to kind of round this to a theme of the festival, which is that I think very often the role of contemplation, of meditation, is viewed as a separate thing from the rest of society, that it's a monastic thing, or it's a personal, inner spirituality thing, that it's somehow divorced from the world and its challenges that we live in. Mm-hmm. And yet, your teacher, Abraham Joshua Heschel, and Thomas Merton, and their relationship, but also what made for the common bonds of that relationship, and the Dalai Lama himself, stand as sort of very strident examples of how the meditative tradition can engage one in the building of a better world. And if you could talk a little bit about the connection between that inner search and that outer need, I think that would be a wonderful way for us to conclude.
Yes, yes. We Jews remember our non-monastic tradition. We are most like the Muslims in that regard. Yes, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism all have monastic communities, monastic sub-communities. And the spiritual life was most cultivated in those monastic communities, and very richly and beautifully cultivated in those monastic communities. Our spirituality was always for householders. You also had to make a living and support large numbers of children. And it was understood that you were living a spiritual life, but that you were also living in the world, and that those two things somehow had to be balanced. We had moments of mystical extremity, shall I say, in our tradition, and they always had to be balanced by, yes, but people have to earn a living. And not only earn a living, but people have mitzvahs to do, commandments to fulfill. And the commandments keep you tied to this world. The idea that you will go off into sort of outer or inner space and become one with God. Yes, but what about praying on time? Yes, but what about putting on your tefillin? Yes, but what about giving to the poor? How can you give to the poor if you have nothing to give? How can you, and what about entertaining guests? And what about dowering poor brides? And what about burying the dead? And what about visiting the sick? All those things are your obligations as a human being, as a member of the Jewish community. And so you cannot allow your spirituality to become too otherworldly. Now, I have a dear friend named Larry Kushner. I don't know if he spoke here in previous years. Larry and I are about the same age, and we were, I would say, two of the great purveyors of the new interest in Jewish mysticism from the 1960s, 70s on. We both wrote, once I got a book of Larry's and I wrote him notes, what does God need me for if he has you? Because even though in different ways we were saying our message was somehow similar, we had three critics of the older generation of rabbis, three of the great rabbis in America. Now they are nebuch, two ghosts and only one still living. We had three rabbis who were very cross with us, very severe. You will revive spirituality and you will take people away from the social justice message. You know who they were. Arnold Jacob Wolf and Stephen Schwarzschild, and now only Gene Borowitz is left of those three. And they were very critical. Be careful. You will distract people from the social justice message. And we never believed it. That was never what we wanted to do and never what our message was. How much we learned from the civil rights movement in this country. How much we learned. You know, for my parents' generation, religion, to some extent, was still backward. It was old world, it was European. And the forces of religion seemed like reactionary forces. My father's family were Russian revolutionaries. They were Jews who joined the revolution. And for them, religion was sort of, it was like the Hasidic rabbis were like the Orthodox Church, the bastion of old world ideology. And the new world had to come, and in order to liberate people from their chains, we had to reject the forces of religion. And there we saw the American black church being the nurturer and giving depth and texture and ultimate meaning to the struggle to change people's lives in a positive way. And I think many once secular Jewish activists learned a tremendous amount from the experience of being involved with American black Christianity, African American Christianity, in the course of the civil rights movement. And so for me, these are, and for Heschel too, praying with his feet and so on, these are two sides of the same coin. You deepen the spiritual life in order to do. Ultimately, Judaism is a religion of deeds, and we judge people not by their inner souls, but by what they do with their lives. And there is no choice between the two. They are one.
Thank you. Thank you all. We have a few quick announcements. One, immediately following this, Rabbi Green will be here listening to the next speaker, Nasser, who's going to be giving a wonderful address. That'll begin at 3, and you want to stay here for that, I'm sure. In between now and then, Rabbi Green will be outside doing a book signing. Several of his books are available if you're interested. And again, he will be speaking this evening at 7 o'clock at the Temple on Brownsboro Road, and you're all invited to join us for a brief service and a lot more of Arthur Green. Thank you. I'm right here. I'm reaching for silence. So we'll take a moment, if you can settle in, for 3 minutes, just to try to let some of these words and some of the silence between them kind of echo a bit within us, and then we'll join together after the second bell in welcoming Rabbi Green outside with the books.